I'd also like to recognise that we're on the land of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation and pay my respects to elders past and present. And I thought I would just mention in relation to speaking about Westconnex that all the terrible damage that is being done to the land by Westconnex is of course building on other damage, but it is damage to Aboriginal land. And down at Sydney Park, we've had a protest camp since last September. And during the time of that camp, we had a visit from the grandmothers against more stolen children, and Jenny Munro, an Aboriginal elder, gave us for the camp a tent that belonged to her sister, a flag that belonged to her sister Isabel Coe, that was flown at the tent embassy. And those sort of connections, I think, are really important to make. Now, just to, first of all, to say that this isn't the first time I think that we've talked about Westconnex at Politics in the Pub. And there's quite a lot of people here who already know quite a lot about it and also have just as valuable ideas as I have about it. So I want to bring you up to date with some of the things that have been happening in the campaign, and then in the second half of what I would say, try to draw some, I guess, bigger threads, more macro threads, which I think relate to the political environment in which we're working. It's very much a macro, micro, daily lived experience, Westconnex, at this stage. It's of course a 33 or much more now, actually, if you take account of the Harbour Tunnel and all that part of it, more than 33 kilometres of mostly tollways, all private, all tolled, that will be, if the government, Gladys Berejiklian and the LNP government get its way, not just owned in terms of the tolls and the roads, but the actual construction and financing of it will be entirely privatised by the middle of next year. And many of the problems that I will share with you tonight will become even more extreme and hard to control. So, you know, 1 week of Westconnex is, in fact, quite busy. And so I'll tell you about some of the things that have been happening this week. And tomorrow, in fact, I have to go to court. This isn't a major event in the campaign against Westconnex at all, but it does, I think, show you the many different levels and arms of the state and of the corporate world as well that are operating in the field trying to crush the campaign to stop Westconnex. So I'll be in court tomorrow morning charged with disobeying a reasonable direction. Unfortunately, the police are lying, but you know, it's 38 years since I had a case in court. There's another one to come up as well. But, you know, it just brought me back to some of the older issues that I was involved with when I read in the so-called statement of facts that I had been repeatedly guilty of trespassing in relation to Westconnex and disobeying police orders, and therefore I should sign a bail condition not to go within 50 metres of Westconnex. That would mean that I couldn't go on Parramatta Road, anywhere around Ashfield or Haberfield, or on the Princes Highway, or for that matter, King Street, which is about 2 blocks from where I live. So when I said to the police, well, you know, I'm sorry, that's just not possible for me to sign that, they seemed really, really surprised that I wouldn't, very irritated, and I finally got to court about 4:10 on that day, and if I hadn't signed the bail condition they put forward, which was still bad, but rather more reasonable, I would have spent the weekend in the Sydney police cells. Now, that is not of huge significance, other than I think it shows the multi-level and different strands of activity and how we have to move between them. Now, just this week alone, the week actually, one of the events of this week, which is quite a big one, which I'll come back to at the end, is Clover Moore. Clover Moore, the Mayor of Sydney, has been a very vigorous campaigner against Westconnex. She's made many attempts to intervene and stop it. And the latest thing from the City of Sydney is an alternative plan. Which is to sort of implement some other ideas, other road projects, other public transport projects, and try to, interrupt what's happening, try to get a halt, try to get a review. It's a somewhat pragmatic exercise, but it does hopefully disrupt the flow of events. But we had a lot of rain this week. And at a very different level last night, St. Peter's Interchange, and I don't know how many of you have been to St. Peter's lately, but it's a really horrible scene. Not to say that every bit of St. Peter's, there's always a community that survives. It's important not to write off any community, but, a number of people I know, their houses were just swept away. Coal, I see other people here, we were there protesting against that. That's why I got arrested in January. And yesterday it was not only underwater, but there's been this terrible stench all around the area. Does anyone live near there? If you do, you could have got watering eyes, you could be feeling sick, your children could be feeling sick. Now, it's not necessarily proved that this is a serious ongoing health danger, but it's clearly very bad for people's sense of health and well-being, and very, very unpleasant. And it will go on for months, even years. Now, one of the really things that I think is important to say, because I feel that Westconnex says so much, Jeff mentioned the planning department, it says so much about what is wrong about our planning system, that they had 7,000 pages of proponents, that is Westconnex, RMS with private consultants, ACOM and others, 7,000 pages of EIS analysis, and somehow they didn't manage to pick up the problem that if you want to develop a massive excavating construction site on what was a very, very toxic landfill, you don't just move around a few bits of dirt and then say put a bit of green stuff, like plastic green stuff. I don't know whether it's plastic, but it looks green. It's not lawn, I can tell you. And then you say, well, we've finished. We've closed the Alexandria landfill. Now we're going to begin construction. Well, of course, construction, you're building up the earth, you're digging into it, the emissions are going to come out. And it turns out, the plan was pre-construction. But this is about construction of a motorway. It just really beggars belief. Dennis Cleash, who is the head of the Sydney Motorway Corporation, which is a private body, publicly owned at the moment, that is responsible for all these projects, he recently went before the Parliamentary Tolls Inquiry, and one of the things he said was that the Alexandria landfill had been remediated. Well, of course, that is a lie. Whether he even knows enough to know it's a lie, I don't actually know. I mean, maybe he doesn't read any media. That wouldn't surprise me either. He probably lives in such a bubble. But, that is the daily reality of what is happening. And then, later in the week, I can't remember, was it Tuesday, we went to Penrith, Tuesday or Wednesday, Monday, sorry, you see I've lost track entirely. So Monday we went to Penrith, and this I think was a really important step in the campaign, because there has been a decision, but across, there's about 12 groups, as always happens in these things, because as something like a tollway moves, as the project moves, local groups spring up. These things are in their nature, tend to be local. So there are 12 groups in a loose alliance, I think you could say, and a decision has been made that one of the crucial strategies will be to oppose these tolled roads, to oppose the tolls. Now, this isn't just about the M4 widening. The M4 widening is the first stage of Westconnex. It was meant to be finished in February. It's not nearly finished. We were out there this week. It's definitely not nearly finished. It's also become, I think, increasingly dangerous. There's been police investigations, TWU investigations, picking up drivers who are speeding, carrying contaminated goods, and tampering with the speedometers, a very, very dangerous practice, and there's been accidents. The whole M4 widening thing is a story in its own, because there's masses of asbestos that's been lying around. That's, again, part of the daily reality of the life of the people of Granville. So, the M4 widening is not tolled. The government wants to put a toll on it. The Labor Party we think, although we think the Labor Party is genuinely opposed to the toll, reimposing a toll on the M4 widening. The most significant thing about that is that that project, that part of the project, could be paid back in 2 years of tolling of the predicted traffic on the M4 motorway. But that is going to be tolled for 43 years. Why is it going to be tolled for 43 years? Because that is needed to pay for the other parts of Westconnex. And there's a traffic sort of expert called Matt Hounsell, who works at the University of Technology now, who some of you may know. And it was Matt that first pointed out to me that really, as it's emerging, what Westconnex is probably about, if it's about anything other than just building roads, making money out of building roads and tolling them, which is what the essential idea is. But it's probably more about bringing a few people from the North Shore west of the city, maybe down through the Southern Highway that Jeff described, and out to their holiday houses on the south coast, or possibly out to Canberra, or maybe a few of them to the airport, but they've already got a route to the airport anyway. So, it's more and more looking like it is, and they're even now describing it as a western bypass for the people in the north. So all the bullshit about this was all about the people in the west was always bullshit. And this is how cynical, our politics are. And it's interesting, when we were out in Western Sydney, we joined with the Penrith Valley unions out there and had a protest. And that is about attempting to bring the east of the city, because we are on the far east right here, to join with the people in the west. And I personally feel it's absolutely crucial politically for our city that we build those links. One of the links that we've built out there, and there's a lot of sympathy for our position on Westconnex amongst some of the campaigners, is some people who are campaigning against a massive incinerator. This is another issue that you could have maybe for a talk in the future. A massive incinerator out near Erskine Park that's being built by Ian Malouf, who owned the Alexandria landfill and was sort of got out of that so they could take that over for Westconnex. He was an illegal asbestos dump at one stage. He's a Liberal donor. Somehow he's ended up getting out of all of that. He's now got a massive waste thing out in Western Sydney, and now he wants to build this incinerator. I could talk more about that, because there's some very sinister sort of suppression of free speech things that are going on out there with that. But at least one of those people was present at our campaign, and we can help them collect signatures on their petition. But also, while we were out there, we saw, and it's quite an exciting development, we saw a $ graffitied on the road on top of a line. And if you have, there's a very good photographer called, so you're driving along the road and you keep seeing $signs. That's going to be really good if we can get more of that going. And Laurie Graham, if you want to have a look at that, Laurie Graham is a very good photographer, came out with this to Penrith, and she did a blog. Have a look at lauriegraham.com and you'll see some really beautiful photos. Yes, L-O-R-R. I can give it to you later. How much longer have I got? I just know I've been chatting on a bit too much. Oh, I'm fine, yeah. Okay, so, that is the Western Suburbs link. On the way, we pass through Haberfield, and I guess most of you have seen Haberfield. This is what you call just sweeping away blocks and blocks. It's even more than St. Peter's. Houses that were very solid houses. I think it's about 1,000 trees. There's 1,300 at Sydney Park, 1,000 at Kingsgrove, 700, I think, at Arncliffe. Now, back when they were planning the M4 East, before they did the new M5, they weren't even counting the trees. It's only because of the work of people like Jeff and others are doing that got sort of upset about the fact of them knocking over garden after garden, whole parks, and that they started, they did actually have to count the trees, and there's some sort of protection for the trees. So Haberfield, as you're going out, but as you get a bit further out, see, we hear about the things in the inner city, but we don't necessarily hear about Homebush, where a whole street has been swept away there too, and where defence housing is going to be next to a ventilated stack, where a really big fig tree used to stand. And we went up onto the bridge that goes over the motorway at Concord, and you can see just how near the houses are going to be overlooking the motorway and apartments. And I'm sure that some of them are less than 50 metres. We have, after all, whole apartments in Euston Road in Alexandria that are less than 2 metres from the motorway. Now, there's plenty of now research and strong medical evidence that shows that anything less than 50 metres from a very busy road, and your chances, life expectancy is going to be less, and you're potentially getting fatal diseases, and children's lung development is affected. So the whole thing, what I'm trying to get across, it's a massive disaster that's unfolding. Now, the other thing that needs to be said is that, and this isn't only happening with Westconnex, is the absolute farce of community consultation. And it's interesting that, you know, when we go back to the 70s and that whole movement, and so a lot of what we talked about then was about community participation in planning. In fact, I remember Jack Mundy, you know, that was the first thing I heard him say. People have a right to say what is going to happen in their city and in their neighbourhoods. And out of that, you know, it was happening all around the world, we got this idea of community consultation. It has become a really terrible farce in the case of Westconnex, because at the moment they're taking feedback on the concept design for the third stage. That is a tunnel between the second stage, which ends around Sydney Park, through to Haberfield and Rozelle, depending exactly where you're going, and then that's going to go right under Balmain and through to the Western Harbour Tunnel. That's if it happens. So we go along to these feedback sessions. Now, I live in just the border of Erskineville and Newtown. You go in, and there's these massive maps, and we actually did get some notice about the feedback session. It must be because, you know, we're on their list or something, but no one else in our street got one. And so no one knew that this is the only session that there has been in Newtown since they came to the Enmore Theatre in just before the last state election, and got a resounding rejection from an audience of thousands of people. So they've not dared to come to Newtown. So they're in this little community centre down the back street, and called the Tom Foster Centre. And, you know, you say, oh, well, we didn't know that your plan was going to cross King Street and come down, you know, under our house. Not that, by the way, that's a huge moment to me at all, actually, because I don't see the tunnelling under as the most horrific thing about all of this, except in some spots. But I do think a lot of houses are in danger of cracking, but I'm not going to, what I'm saying is I'm not particularly more concerned because it's my house. But then they then say, oh, no, this is just a concept. It may not be like this at all. So then we say, well, when's the feedback session? When's this feedback period finishing? So it took me a few times to get them to tell me that would be August the 4th. When's the EIS? You know, and then we'll take account of all your feedback. By the way, they don't put out forms anymore, so anyone can write on them, unless you ask for them. And then the EIS is due to be lodged with the planning department about mid-August. You know, so there's no way that they're going to, you know, the whole thing is, and all these people walk around, and they're all called community engagement. And they're kind of like a little bit like police, because at one demonstration, one told me that I was on a restraining order, which sounded like I was involved in some sort of domestic dispute or something. He'd been told that, and he's a community engagement officer. So their job is really to massage the community, lie where necessary. So I'm not saying they all know they're lying. I mean, they might have only been hired yesterday. And when you probe a lot of people working for Westconnex, of course they're not working for it. You say, do you actually get paid by Westconnex? And they say, I am working for Westconnex today. So I say, oh, so you're actually working for another company. So if I was to, you know, do more research on LinkedIn, for example, I'll often find they're working for a major engineering company. Most of the people working for the Sydney Motorway Corporation are probably on secondment and contracts from other big engineering companies. So these people have no sense of any obligation to the public or the community. They see the community as something to be manipulated, and that is the latest in community consultation. Now, of course, once the EIS comes out, we will do a massive import of fairly complicated submissions. We'll make their life as difficult as we can to slow down the process. But the reality is that the decision has been made. We cannot change it through the EIS process. There is no independent EIS anymore. The EISs are done by people appointed by Westconnex. And I just wanted to mention in relation to this, one company, or two companies, ACOM and Leighton's, because this brings me more to the macro thing and what is this really all about. And we mentioned the privatised road system, major road system, that's what it really is. You really got to look at the origins. I've started with this week, but if you look at the origins of this, even before the LNP government, you probably remember there was other iterations of M4 going through Leichhardt and other things that were during the Labor government. But let's just take it to before the LNP government got in, there was pressure, movement behind the scenes for them to commit to at least one big tollway. And that initiative came from the people like Tony Shepherd, who business was then head of, I think, Transurban, then head of the Business Council. Transurban's got coming onto a monopoly or near monopoly, strong interests in tollways in Australia. They had been involved in a number of failed privately funded toll roads. So what they needed was public support and public input. So there was meetings coming forward with a new model. And the new model was that it would be publicly funded and then it would be sold off and the tolls would then raise the rest of the money needed. And that was the whole idea. So when the New South Wales LNP government got in, Infrastructure New South Wales was appointed with Greiner at the head. Now, Nick Greiner, ex-Premier, was one of the people who'd been first involved after he had to resign as Premier, who got involved in toll roads. And interesting enough, I was looking at some old publications I did with students at UTS in 1992, and we broke down the whole transport industry then and the directors of the board, and you could see where all the road companies and the concrete companies were involved, and Nick Greiner was in there already then. So he came up with the idea of Westconnex, not quite the same as it is now, but Westconnex. Now, at that stage, they asked in Leighton's, ACOM, Macquarie Bank and others to plan the project. So they were the ones who developed the idea. So of course it's an idea that suits their interests, but that was never focused on by the media. I found that information by going through in detail every news release, but otherwise it's just sort of like something in the Fin Review and probably most people don't read it and therefore it doesn't register. So then ACOM went on to do the traffic modelling for the first business plan. Now, Leighton's and ACOM have been involved in some projects in Queensland, in particular the Clem 7, which was failed. And out of that was a failure. And Morris Blackburn, a legal firm, took class actions in that, and more than $500 million in damages has been paid out in class actions for false and misleading traffic projections by ACOM. While that's all going on, ACOM is invited in to do the traffic projections for the Westconnex. So, how can that is a government that is just making decisions, and Jeff talked about the people and caring about people, just making decisions to suit their mates. So then ACOM is quite a trendy firm, actually. I mean, there's they do some quite good design. A lot of young engineers probably think they're fine, but the fact is they did the EIS for the M4, the EIS for the M4 widening, the closure plan for the Alexandria landfill, other commercial contracts on the project while they're doing the EIS, and now they're doing the EIS for the M4, M5. And then when the federal government, Tony Abbott, pushed to get a $2 billion concessional loan to speed up the second stage instead of waiting for the tolls to get all that speeded up. Who should the federal department go to for their financial advice but ACOM, who was already advising the Westconnex Delivery Authority and the RMS on Westconnex? And look, I would say that once, I think, 10 years ago, that would be regarded like, I think what is a scandal shifts over time. But once the situation with Westconnex would have been regarded as a really serious political scandal. But we've kind of moved on, and privatisation and conflicts of interest have sort of disappeared, been dissolved, and we're living in a different system. It's kind of a sort of new form of state, more of a corporate state, where the state is serving private interests. I'd like to share Jeff's optimism about the Greater Sydney Commission. I think it's a bit of a stretch when Lucy Turnbull said you didn't know anything was happening in Haberfield. But look, there are good people working in these organisations, and people have to have jobs. And therefore, some of the luxury that some of us have had in our lives to mainly working jobs that we sort of believed in, a younger generation does not mostly have that luxury. A lot of people end up working, squirreling away in corporate law firms when they'd rather be working for a community legal centre. This happens all the time. So, I think that the last thing I'd like to say, and then I will stop, is that then obviously, we can campaign against this, and we will continue to campaign. Like if any of you come, there's going to be a lantern parade that some of these people over here can probably add more to, but along the route coming up, I think it's late July now. But, we do need also a political solution, and Clover's come up with this plan. Some parts of it you probably, agree with, other parts you might not. Like if you live on King George's Road, you're not going to embrace the idea that that could be widened. It's already a nightmare. And one of the most polluted sites for various schools in Sydney. So, it's hard to be enthusiastic about that feature. But the, move to stop what's happening and come up with a more priority on public transport, you'd absolutely need to support. And then there's the Labor Party. Because the thing with the Labor Party is that they did switch on the Victorian East-West Link and in Western Australia. There was an election coming up, and they switched and they opposed the motorways, and that definitely played a big role. So people have been holding out for the Labor Party to make a shift. I think their behaviour on Westconnex has been appalling. But for example, before the state election, Anthony Albanese handed out a pamphlet to everyone in the Granger electorate claiming he had spoken up for the community on so many occasions in Parliament. So I went through every speech he made in Parliament and proved that that wasn't true, which didn't make him, hugely happy. As you can imagine, he's such a sort of grumpy person. He doesn't like that sort of thing at all. But, it'd be great if they'd change their mind. They can see it's a disaster. But then yesterday, Luke Foley came out in the Daily Telegraph and said that they supported all stages of the project. And now the coalition of groups have written to him asking for an explanation. So we'll see what comes out of that. But, I think the campaign, instead of dying, despite the fact it's moving ahead, is actually growing the number of groups. It's organisationally, always these things are complex. But, if any of you can support in any way, please do. The problem is, I realise, is that there are so many issues, such as green spaces, which I would like to give much more time to. There's so many issues that you can't all be involved in everything all the time. But if you would like to be more involved, there's Jim is here, Amy, I'm here, other people you could talk to, Cole, as well, about how you might get involved. Thank you.